My name is Joe Peroni, and this is the Rise Above Project. And today I want to talk about a very important word in psychology. As a matter of fact, I think I'm hearing it too much in regular society and on social media. So it needs to be talked about. The word that I'm speaking of is this word called triggered. Now, the word trigger actually does have a real definition, and it would be a trigger is a stimulus that elicits a response in a person. That's pretty much it. In psychology, it can be a very important word, obviously. Like when we're looking at PTSD, for example, a loud sound can definitely trigger a response from somebody. Now, working with sex offenders, we do talk about triggers. Let's say, for example, a trigger for a sex offender could be a woman wearing a short dress. Now, that could be triggering just in saying that to somebody, right? But here's the point. Sex offenders and everybody else who's in therapy needs to be held accountable and responsible for their triggers. So there's no way a person who is getting sex offender treatment can say that a girl in a short dress is triggering. And what do we think about that? Well, the person who's the sex offender has to work on this. We don't expect the world or to blame women for wearing short dresses. Now, that seems obvious, but it doesn't seem obvious in terms of how many times and how misused the word trigger is. And I'm hearing this from people. I'm also hearing it from therapists who actually teach this to their clients, that their partners are responsible for their triggering. So if you're an emotionally dysregulated person and you keep saying that everybody that's in your orbit is triggering you, and that's why everybody else around you has issues and they need to change, that's not right. The truth is that you have to take responsibility for yourself. There are some other words that are also overused in psychology, like boundaries, toxic, like everybody's relationship is toxic now, which I think is kind of funny, but we'll address that at another time. But what I want to do today, again, I want to talk about the term trigger. And then I want to read a fable by somebody named Rabbi Friedman. He has a fable, and it's great. And of course, being a fable, there's a moral to the story, and it's called A Nervous Condition. Actually, I want to read that, but I think that that's a lazy way to do a show, just to read somebody else's work. And so I want to read that, which I'm going to do later, but I also want to add to the thought, because he doesn't use the word trigger, but he definitely makes the point of how it's very difficult to deal with people who are overly sensitive. Now, here's some of the questions that should come up. Number one, who is responsible if somebody's triggered? I have alluded to it already. The person who's triggered, that's the one. You can't use that as an excuse. As a matter of fact, there's a great book out. It's called Stop Walking on Eggshells. And that's the point. If somebody is going to play the role of a person who's so sensitive and just that everything offends them, everything bothers them, there are words for people like that. I mean, they don't always apply, but we can look at the word covert narcissist, reverse narcissism, where they make it about them, that the world has to change for them instead of them learning how to adapt with a difficult society. Like, here's an example. This happens a lot. Like, let's say you are a person who's in very good shape and you walk into some type of gathering, a party, a business meeting, and everybody notices that you are much more in shape than everybody else. You trigger everybody else's insecurities. Who has the problem? Everybody else. They need to get on a diet. They need to start working out. They need to start doing something. Or if somebody comes in and they're a doctor and somebody gets triggered, well, it could be because somebody, maybe they wanted to have a higher education. Maybe they wanted to go back to school and they didn't. But now they get triggered because somebody said, my name is Dr. So-and-so. Well, who should it be? Should the doctor not say that they're a doctor? Should the doctor give up their license, to make everybody else feel good? Should good-looking people try to be ugly to appease people who are not taking care of themselves? That doesn't make sense, right? But it seems like a lot of people these days, they use the word trigger and they think the world needs to change for them. And it's like, oh, hold on a second. We have to watch out for this person over here. They're being triggered, so we have to change our language. We have to change our clothes. We have to change everything about the way we act. Now, I'm not talking about abuse, okay? I'm talking about, just basic stuff. Here's a question. Are triggered people empathic? Because you hear this all the time. I am so triggered all the time because I have so much empathy and I care so much about people that it just hurts my soul. And so that's why I get triggered so easily, because I'm such a sensitive human being. I don't know. We have to take a look at that, because really what it seems like, people who are offended easily tend to rage. They tend to be angry. They tend to be very critical of others, which is totally the opposite of being empathetic and compassionate and caring, right? So it means that they care more about themselves. And typically, when people are triggered, it correlates to a very low self-esteem, very a low level of maturity. And actually, there's quite a few that are more towards the cluster B personalities disorders, such as narcissism, histrionic, borderline, things like this. So it's not correlated to an empathetic, caring person. People who feel good about themselves, who have a high level of self-esteem, who are going in the direction in their life that they want and they feel good about themselves, they tend not to be so-called triggered and have a negative response that's elicited just by a word of another human being, or by let's say, the success of another human being. That makes no sense. So let's get to the story that I want to read. You know what? But actually, before the story, let me get to some other stuff, because I actually have some good evidence here. Let's take a look at a Harvard psychology professor, and he's a PTSD expert. His name is Dr. Richard McAnally. This is what he says. He explained in a 2016 essay in the New York Times that severe emotional reactions triggered by course material, I guess he's also a professor, right? Reactions triggered by course material are a signal that students need to prioritize their mental health and obtain evidence-based cognitive behavioral therapies that will help them overcome their PTSD. In other words, severe emotional reactions are not an indication that professors or others should warn students in advance that material could be triggering for those with PTSD, nor that potentially triggering material should be removed from the syllabi. Constantly warning people with PTSD about possible triggers could potentially even interfere with their recovery. As Lukianoff and Haidt point out in their newest book, The Coddling of the American Mind, the avoidance of triggers is not a treatment for PTSD. It is a classic, where is it? It's a classic symptom of it. In fact, according to Dr. McAnally, therapies that promote recovery from PTSD involve gradual, systematic exposure to traumatic memories until the capacity of those memories to trigger distress diminishes. So again, there are people out there that are misusing the term trigger, and that's understandable. I get that. What I don't understand is the amount of therapists today who are misusing it and allowing their clients to use that as an excuse to say that everything around them is a problem except for them. Now, I don't want to give up anybody here. I have a bunch of clients over the years, and I'm going to try to put like a sentence together that coordinates a bunch of them together. So here's a type of complaint that I hear. Somewhat of a quote. If you throw me into a rage or a blackout, you are going to regret it because I will hurt you or maybe somebody else. Look at all the word use here. If you throw me into a blackout or a rage, because I've had clients over the years that say, this person did this to me. They said this and I freaked out and I have to freak out. And then so you do use, just like the Harvard professor said, you use evidence-based material like cognitive behavioral therapy. And you say, well, are there alternative thoughts that you could have used? When somebody said a word and you didn't like that word and your first thought was to punch them in the face or to scream as much as you can, what was the thought? Well, it was such a harsh reality to your self-esteem that you needed to lash out. Okay, so what could it be? Could it be that other people are allowed an opinion? What are the alternative thoughts that you could think of? Anything other than raging so much that you go into a blackout that you have no idea what you did or what you said, right? Like, so I see this a lot. Like, I understand triggering, but many of the people who complain and they say this person, that person, the other person, the TV show I watched, the radio show I watched, the song that I heard, the person driving down the street, all of this stuff that triggers people. Listen, the psych wards, hospitals, jails are filled with people who will readily tell you that it was somebody else who triggered them and they have no way to respond in an appropriate manner. And if they have therapists now that are actually going along with them, going with this, I don't think it makes any sense. So we need to call it out as we see it. By the way, I could have started off this show with a trigger warning, right? To say this is going to trigger somebody because somebody's going to say that's not true. It's somebody else's fault. You know, it has to be them. Okay, but here's the thing. We have data and we have evidence, empirical evidence that says if you even start off a conversation with this might be a trigger for you, you know, here's a trigger warning, that alone is enough to trigger somebody, right? Because you're setting them up, you're telling them that they may not be equipped to handle a word, some type of, you know, a statement, an idea that they don't like, is some type of emotional violence to their heart and soul, right? So they already get triggered by saying the word triggered. So now you can't even talk to them. So that becomes interesting too. So all I'm saying is we need to take responsibility, each and every one of us, right? Like I'm a human. I've been triggered by things, right? Like when I was a kid and I had no money and I wanted money and I wanted things, it would be slightly triggering, maybe. I wouldn't use that word. It would be a different word for them, but it could be triggering if somebody your age, especially if they're a teenager, right? And they're driving down the street in a brand new Corvette, right? It could be that. Or it could be something that motivates you to do better, right? Like that could be, right? That's possible. If you're whatever age you are and you want to look a certain way and you see somebody else who you believe looks better than you, doesn't have to be triggering. What is that? Like that's a weakness. It's pathetic, actually. What you want to do is look at that person and go, how do I bridge that gap from where I am to where I would like to be? That's it. Use it as a motivational tool. It doesn't have to trigger you to be angry at everybody. It makes no sense. So I'm going to read Dr. Friedman's fable. It's very interesting. So I'm going to tell you the moral of the story right up front so you know what we're looking at here. The moral of the story is beware of the insensitivities of the sensitive. Or you could say, make it up into modern times, beware when people say they're triggered, because typically they're the most dangerous ones, right? Let's take it from the top. It's about 4 pages long if you want to go through this with me. If not, you've had enough. You could probably look this up yourself and read it, but I'm going to try to read this here. Okay, The Nervous Condition by Rabbi Friedman. When little John was about a year old, his parents noticed very thin fibers protruding through his pores. After another few months, the fibers had extended themselves. They began to form curls. The condition alarmed his parents, so they took little John to a doctor. The physician, after examining him carefully, called in several other specialists. They, in turn, summoned their colleagues, and after conferring for several hours, announced little John was unique in medical history. His ganglia were growing outside of his skin. Since there was no record of this having happened before, it was not clear what the ultimate effects of such a condition would be. And since little John was otherwise in excellent health, it was decided to do nothing for a while but observe. Of course, one immediate problem was little John's rapidly developing extreme sensitivity to everything and everyone around him. The doctors alerted his parents, warning them that they must be super sensitive to every move and every touch. And being very sensitive people anyway, they readily agreed. As little John grew, so did his ganglia, until they trailed about him as he walked. And while it was not a pretty sight, surprisingly, it turned out to have some advantages. He learned from the very beginning, for example, first from his ever-concerned parents, and then from others, that he could always count on someone watching out for him. Indeed, he learned early in life that anyone who came into his orbit would always pay attention to his every move for fear of hurting him. He found that he could plow a path through any group of friends by just walking toward them. People would always retreat at his advance for fear of stepping on his feelings. When he engaged in sports, or when he just wanted to be first in line, all he had to do was start in the direction he chose, and his approach itself proved to be an open sesame. Sometimes he encountered people who had not been forewarned about his condition. And then, of course, he had to point it out early in their relationship as soon as possible. Once they understood, however, they never tried to get in his way. All of this is not to say that individuals never felt resentment toward little John. Some of his classmates, and one of his brothers in particular, who were most competitive with him for certain goals, felt handicapped by his handicap, but they never spoke it aloud. All managed to quiet their resentment with self-recriminations about their own insensitivity. And so it went. Little John graduated high school, having done fewer homework assignments than any other child who ever attended, and he obtained a secure job, though he was less qualified than most of those seeking the same exact job. One day he met a woman whom he liked. Being extremely shy and not having enough confidence or experience to refute her own poor image of herself, she was thrilled at the advances of this very attentive, if somewhat strange creature. She treated him with the utmost deference, and her pity soon became love. Everywhere they went, she watched out for him. In time, the guiding principle of her life became, how can I help this man avoid pain? But after they had been married for a while, she began to tire. She still tried, for this poor man could not help himself. But it became increasingly difficult for her to be constantly mindful of all of his needs. She decided to confess her increasing insensitivity to her friends. She mentioned it to her family, to her minister, to her doctor. She sought professional help. All comforted her and sympathized, but could offer very little practical advice. And so they urged her to be more patient. She tried again to shape her existence based on his needs. Then the headache started. Then the little tick in her eye. Soon she found that she was losing weight. Colitis further restricted her freedom. And it was not long before her thoughts were bordering on suicide. But she dared not tell little John, of course, for fear of hurting him. Why, if he knew that all of this was due to his condition, he would be unconsolable. One day, as she was walking home, she chanced upon a mother cat giving suck to her newborn kittens. As they scrambled over one another in their thirst, the mother carefully guided each one to its turn, stretching out a firm but gentle paw as she lay contentedly on her side. Then, Little John's wife noticed that one of the kittens had been born lame. Its leg had not been fully formed, and it had more difficulty maneuvering than the others. Strangely, it was also the most aggressive. While the other kittens when they were satisfied, they went off to sleep. But this one kept coming back to wiggle its way in front of the thirsty others. Each time, however, the mother cat pushed it away, at first gently, and then with successively harder whacks. Little John's wife watched the poor kitty and the inhuman mother. But when she returned home, upon finding her husband reading in a room, she planted herself in the doorway and began to stare. A little while later, Little John, desiring to enter into another room, marched straight for the doorway that framed his wife. But she did not budge. Closer he came, closer, never thinking actually to ask her to move. After all, he had never had to ask anyone anything to get his own way before. Suddenly, he stopped, confused. What should he do? First, he assumed his most wounded look. Then he tried one that was even more winsome and boyish. But his wife was like a rock. In desperation, he finally spoke. "Move. You know I can't squeeze by." "Nothing. What's the matter with you?" he yelled. "What are you trying to do to me? This is like a trap." Then she did begin to move, but not aside, but rather directly toward him. He retreated. She continued on. He moved back faster, but still on she came, and soon he was cornered. "Have you lost your mind?" he said incredulously. "Careful there. You almost actually hurt me," he said, pathetically. And that did it. She raised a foot and stomp. With all her might, she came down hard on one of the trailing nerve endings. He screeched, either from pain or from shock. Again she stomped, and again and again and again. He ran past her, but she pursued. He screeched again, and the scream encouraged her more. Stomp, stomp. She continued chasing him from one room to the other, up and down the stairs, to the cellar, to the attic, through the kitchen, to their bedroom, until, exhausted, they both collapsed and fell asleep. When Little John's wife awoke, her headache was gone for the first time in months. Her eye, too, had lost its quiver. And for the first time in a very long time, she sighed without a pain and felt relaxed. But more astounding still was what she saw beside her. For when she looked over at Little John, she found that his ganglia were no longer curled around him all about the floor. On closer examination, she realized that they had disappeared altogether. In fact, they had completely recoiled inside his skin. And again, Rabbi Friedman, that's a nervous condition. The moral of the story: beware the insensitivities of the sensitive. Keeping it up to date, beware of people who say that they're triggered all the time, because they're the ones who actually don't care about your feelings, and they don't care about making themselves better. Now, let me go over this really quick. I could probably do a show on each and every one of these, but I do want to say this to put this all together in the same show. Here are some questions that you should ask yourself if you go back over the story, or you're thinking about it, or if you are somehow in a relationship or working with somebody, or you work with someone who always declares that they're triggered and tries to make you change your personality for them, and they take no responsibility for themselves. Let's go through some questions about this story. Number one, if the wife had come to you for advice, how would you have given her insensitivity training? Keeping in mind, right? It wasn't the wife who was insensitive. It was her husband who was insensitive, right? Number two, how would you get this man to take responsibility for his own feelings? And there you go for the reason for the show today. There's too many therapists buying into the fact that when people get triggered, you need to coddle them instead of make them stronger. Number three, how can the wife continue to keep her husband's ganglia sheathed? Good question, right? How can she do it? By holding him responsible for his words and his actions. That's how. And treating him like he's not a child. Okay, you don't have to coddle people because they have a feeling that they don't like. That's part of the answer. Number 4, was their marriage a good match? I'll answer that too. Their marriage was not in the beginning because it was destroying her mentally and physically. But because she had the courage to put him in his place, she healed herself and she healed him. So overall, she was the only one who had the courage to put him in his place and not do this, I'm insensitive because I have a life too, and I don't want to walk on eggshells every minute of my life. She decided not to do that. So was their marriage a good match? Absolutely yes. Number 5, why are people able to control others by being easily hurt? Great question by the rabbi here. They are because we're told to be nice and caring and loving all the time. That's number 1. So we wouldn't want to hurt somebody's feelings, right? And yet they're the ones who are using that to get a leg up on people. A lot of times they're the abusive ones. Not always, but many times. So that's why it's easy to do that. The other thing is too, if you have a certain environment that you grow up in, you might be a little bit more codependent. That's, for another show, which I have talked about that in other shows. But that's a reason. A lot of people too, they go through what's fog. They have, fear of hurting other people. They feel like they're obligated to them, obligated to be a good person. And good people don't push people too much, especially when they have a bad feeling, right? And they also feel guilty for making people accountable for their words and actions. So sometimes that's hard to do for people. Number 6, when is adaptation in another healthy and when is it destructive? Another great question by the rabbi. The wife at some point was trying to adapt to the weakness of her husband, and that was making her hurt physically and emotionally. That type of adaptation is unhealthy. Forcing somebody or encouraging them, putting them in a position to take responsibility for themselves might be difficult, but that is a good adaptation. That's my short answer for that. In what ways can being concerned for oneself be freeing for another? And here you go again. And this is the bedrock thing of therapy. Stop concerning yourself with what the other person does and how they feel and what they think. Their responsibility is to fix themselves. Your responsibility is to be the best you that you can be. So yes, once you're concerned about yourself and fixing yourself and making yourself the best person you can be, and stop relying on other people to make you happy or to be doing these be your entertainment committee. It's freeing for both people when you both are healthy human beings, physically and emotionally. In what way can it be empathetic to put another in pain? Again, I hate to keep saying this, but another brilliant question. It's always, not always, but as a personal trainer, I always have empathy and compassion when I put somebody in pain because there's growing pains. If you want to be comfortable all the time, that's a disease. Most of the time when people are trying to be comfortable all the time, they run themselves into that they're going to be emotionally weak and physically weak. There's a lot of diseases that come from just being overly comfortable. So I can name many, many ways that being empathic is really pushing somebody to be a better person and not to keep walking on eggshells because you're allowing them. Right? You're enabling people to be bad. You're enabling them to be childish. You're enabling them to say, oh, I have a feeling, but then everybody else has to change. That's not true. Like if you're dealing with someone who's has a propensity to drink or to do drugs when they feel bad, you can't walk around them all the time going, oh, do you feel good today? Do you feel good today? I need to make you feel good. No, you don't. They need to do that. And it's not your responsibility if they drink, they do drugs, or they yell, or they scream, or they gamble. That's not your job. Number 9, how does challenge convey confidence? Again, nobody who has a really good confidence level of self-esteem wants to challenge themselves. That's this whole part about just being soft and being weak. All right, they want everybody else to change for them. So as somebody is trying to do better and they hold themselves to account, you can definitely say that there's a level of confidence there. Number 10, how might the approach that the wife finally took be translated into running organizations or a whole country? Again, great question. Probably talk about this for hours. But the point is to hold people to account. Like I said before, I've had clients over and over again to say, that person made me angry. And it's like, oh, okay, but nobody makes you angry. You're choosing to be angry. So you can do things in a calmer, more productive way. And if you ask them, what's the best tool that they know how to deal with that? They'll tell you, I run away. I just avoid it. Well, that's exactly one of the symptoms of PTSD. So you're making yourself into a person that's always going to have an issue. That's not how you handle it. You have to confront issues straight on. I hope today's show was valuable. There's a lot of information here. And again, the show's about 31 minutes long. But hey, listen, I can't take this much information in one show and do it in 30 seconds, right? Like if people want it that way. And that's another thing too. It triggers people when a show's too long because they say that they don't have enough ability to focus anymore. Listen, that's not my fault. And I don't care, right? It's your job to be able to focus on things long enough so you can do things in a productive way in your life. And if you can't watch a video with really great information and you're only going to look for like 30 seconds and 40-second spots on these shorts or these 1-minute things where they really don't go in depth, well, then have at it, right? Like, I am not going to participate in that, right? You need to be held accountable and be responsible for your own growth of yourself. And that doesn't include doing something for 10 seconds and being done. If you want to be a bodybuilder, listen, everybody wants to be a bodybuilder, right? But like a lot of guys have said, yeah, everybody wants to be a bodybuilder, but nobody wants to lift heavy weight, right? Nobody wants to diet and nobody wants to be consistent. Well, then you can't be a bodybuilder, right? You can't be physically and emotionally healthy without doing the work. So if you're going to look for shows that are 45 seconds long that tell you exactly what you want to hear, and they say trigger, everybody in the world's triggered now, well, then go for it. But you're not going to get any better. Anyway, my name is Joe Peroni. This is the Rise Above Project. Hopefully this had some value to you. And please tell a friend. Thank you.